Welcome to NVL Travel Documentary. Relay is 6 years old. He used to dream of becoming an astronaut, flying among the stars and exploring the galaxy. But tonight, all he wants is a warm bed and a roof to keep out the cold winds of the American Midwest.
पूरी पुलिस की तरह देखो भाई देखो
You've seen many travel documentaries that reveal stunning landscapes, curious facts about countries, or breathtaking country documentaries showcasing cultures and traditions. But what if I told you that right here, in a state often called the heart of America, there's a hidden truth, a quiet crisis unfolding in the shadows? Children like Eli aren't just facing hardship, they're growing up in a world where poverty quietly collides with deeper societal issues, where survival sometimes brushes against the edge of the underground economy and urban crime. NVL Travel Documentary takes you past a postcard into the Iowa you were never meant to see. Number 1. The Postcard cracks. Iowa, a beautiful lie? When most people think of Iowa, they picture golden cornfields stretching into the horizon, peaceful towns where neighbors still wave hello, and a pace of life that feels like a gentle breeze in an otherwise chaotic world. On the surface, it's postcard perfect, the very image of small-town America. But look a little closer, and you'll see the cracks. Beneath the beauty lies a growing storm, one that's silently changing the lives of thousands. This is an Iowa few talk about, one where families sleep in their cars behind gas stations, where food banks are running dry, and where children trade bedtime stories for the cold silence of makeshift shelters. Between the year 2020 and 2023, homelessness in Iowa surged by 23%, according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. That's not just a statistic, that's hundreds of real people losing their homes every year, and as we move through 2025, local shelters are reporting record-high demand, with many turning people away each night for lack of space. What's especially haunting is the contradiction. This is a state with a $2 billion surplus, enough to fund housing programs, job training, and child nutrition statewide. Yet that wealth never seems to reach those who need it most. How can a place known for abundance leave so many behind? Iowa feeds the nation, yet nearly 1 in 10 residents faces food insecurity. It exports hope, but imports despair. And the pain isn't spread evenly. It falls hardest on single mothers, veterans, low-income workers, and children, the ones least equipped to weather life without support. They don't ask for much, just a warm bed, a full meal, a little dignity. But make no mistake, this isn't just about hardship, it's about disconnection. A system once built to lift people up now lets them slip through cracks wide enough to swallow entire communities. Boy. Because once you see who's being left behind, the next question becomes why, and who profits from keeping them there. Number 2. Beneath the surface. The roots beneath the ruin. To understand how Iowa, a state so rich in soil and spirit, ended up with families sleeping on sidewalks, you have to dig beneath the numbers. This crisis didn't appear overnight. It crept in, quietly, as a slow unraveling of support, until people had nowhere left to go. Walk through the edges of Des Moines after sunset, and you'll see it for yourself. In alleyways lit by flickering neon signs, families huddle beneath highway overpasses. Mothers tuck their children into worn sleeping bags laid out on cold concrete. Some use the glow of gas station lights as makeshift nightlights, while others sit silently in their cars, not resting, just waiting for dawn. But these aren't just the unlucky. Many of them once had jobs, apartments, routines. What changed? Rent. In the past 4 years, housing costs in cities like Des Moines and Cedar Rapids have skyrocketed. What used to cost $800 a month now demands over $2,200, a 40 to 50% increase in less than half a decade. Meanwhile, minimum wage in Iowa has remained stagnant at $7.25 per hour, unchanged since the year 2009. For a single parent working full-time at minimum wage, even the cheapest one-bedroom apartment is now out of reach. Then came the end of pandemic relief. Eviction moratoriums lifted, rental subsidies dried up. Suddenly, people who had barely held on were pushed over the edge. And if the rent doesn't break you, life will. A broken wrist, a sick child, a prescription you can't afford. With nearly 5% of Iowans uninsured, a single medical emergency can wipe out a family's savings overnight. Many face an impossible choice: pay for the doctor or for the roof over your head. There are those who say, why don't they just move? But move where? The shortage of affordable housing is everywhere, not just in big cities. In rural Iowa, aging mobile homes are falling apart, while new developments cater to wealthier outsiders. Every missed paycheck feels like a countdown, every rising bill a tightening noose. And in the midst of it all, Iowa's poorest residents aren't just slipping through the cracks, they're being squeezed out by a system that's no longer built for them. But this pressure, it doesn't disappear, it builds, it broods resentment, and sometimes it drives people to do things they never imagined. Number 3, the forgotten faces. Who's paying the price? When a system begins to crack, it's always the most vulnerable who fall first and hardest. In Iowa's growing crisis, the faces behind the numbers are overwhelmingly women, children, and the elderly. Not because they did something wrong, but because they've been left with the fewest lifelines to hold on to. Take Lisa, a 32-year-old single mother in Cedar Rapids. She used to wait tables at a local diner, bringing home just enough to cover rent, groceries, and daycare for her 2 young kids. Then, after the pandemic, her rent jumped by $400 a month. Her hours were cut. She held on as long as she could, borrowing money, skipping meals, but eventually, the math didn't work. One morning, she came home to find an eviction notice on her door, printed, folded, and taped without a sound. Just like that, her home became a memory. Now, Lisa and her children share a narrow cot in an overcrowded shelter, surrounded by strangers and the cold hume of fluorescent lights. Her 5-year-old daughter still asks when they're going back to their old room, the one with the pink curtains and the bookshelf full of bedtime stories. Lisa's story isn't unique. It's the new normal. Across Iowa, more and more women are raising children with no address, relying on soup kitchens and church basements just to make it through the week. These mothers often put their kids to bed hungry, hiding their own pain behind forced smiles. They wait in lines that stretch around the block, hoping the shelter doesn't run out of space tonight. Children caught in this cycle often stop going to school. Without a stable address, it becomes harder to enroll or stay enrolled. Education takes a back seat to survival, and childhood, little by little, is lost. And then there are the elderly, men and women who work their entire lives as janitors, factory workers, home care aides, only to end up holding cardboard signs on the roadside. Some sleep in their cars, others in tents tucked between freeway exits. Wrists aching from arthritis, backs bent from years of labor, they now ask for help from a world that seems to have forgotten them. This is not a distant tragedy. It's happening now, in parking lots and bus stations, in libraries and church steps, all across the state. The people bearing the brunt of this crisis are not just statistics. They're mothers, grandfathers, and kids with dreams that don't fit inside a shelter bag. And they're still here, waiting for the world to notice. Number 4. Stories from the parking lot. I didn't know silence could be so loud. That's what he told me. A man in his early 40s, sitting on the edge of a rusty minivan in a Walmart parking lot. The door. I used to hate the sound of the neighbor's lawnmower, he said, forcing a smile. Now, I'd give anything to hear it again. Noise meant life. This, he motioned around the lot. This is just waiting. He's been sleeping there with his daughter for over a month. She's 6, bright eyes, tangled hair, still wearing her school backpack, even though she hasn't seen a classroom in weeks. He lets her think they're on a camping adventure. That's what he calls it when she asks why they can't go home. Nearby, I saw another woman boiling water over a portable stove in a park. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, from hunger. Some days, she said, you choose between food and insulin. You pick which one keeps you alive longer. Everywhere I went, it was the same story told in different voices. Parking lots becoming bedrooms, tents tucked into city parks, church steps doubling as dinner tables. At the local shelter, the line stretched around the block. It was 20 degrees that night. I asked one man how long he'd been waiting. He didn't look at me, just said, long enough to stop expecting anything warm. These aren't lazy people. These aren't strangers to hard work. Many had jobs, some still do. But when rent goes from $800 to over $1,200 a month, there's no budget plan in the world that can stretch enough. What struck me wasn't just their struggle, it was their quiet dignity, the way they looked after each other, the way they still said thank you when handed a meal, even if it was their only one that day. And maybe the most heartbreaking thing, they still believe someone might be listening. Number 5. More than just homelessness. The homelessness crisis in Iowa isn't just about the lack of shelter, it's about what happens after, the ripple effects that quietly dismantle lives and unravel communities. Children are often the first to be swept into this cycle. When families lose their homes, kids lose access to stable education. They bounce between schools or drop out entirely. Without a fixed address, enrolling becomes a bureaucratic nightmare. Even for those who stay in school, the daily stress of uncertainty makes it hard to focus, to dream, to feel safe. National data from recent school years show that over 1 million students in the U.S. are now classified as homeless. In Iowa, that number is growing quietly, with each family pushed into temporary living. For adults, the pressure mounts in silence. The daily grind of finding shelter, securing food, keeping kids warm, it wears people down. Chronic stress and untreated depression are everywhere, and with little to no mental health support, many simply shut down. You can't plan for the future when you're in survival mode every day. A study in 2025 found that low-quality individuals who lacked trust in their communities made more short-term decisions that deepened their financial struggles. In Iowa, where inequality is rising, that breakdown in trust is becoming more visible and more dangerous. The result? A community split in two, not by race, not by geography, but by survival. On one side, families with stable jobs, mortgages, weekend soccer games. On the other, families sleeping in shelters or cars, living day to day on church handouts and shrinking hope. And somewhere between them is a growing silence, a discomfort that keeps neighbors from seeing each other, talking to each other. This isn't just poverty, it's a feedback loop of disconnection. When trust breaks down, support vanishes, and when that happens, inequality becomes more than just numbers. It becomes a lived experience that separates people who share the same streets, the same parks, the same weather. Except some walk those streets with confidence, and others with fear. Number 6. 2 Iowas, 1 state. Iowa has just confirmed a $2 billion state budget surplus, a number so large it could fund housing for every unhoused family in the state several times over. And yet, in the shadows of its new office parks and shiny infrastructure upgrades, thousands of Iowans are sleeping in tents, huddled beneath highway bridges, or curled up in their cars behind grocery stores. How can a state have that much money and still have children going to bed on concrete? In the heart of the Midwest, Iowa's fields are rich with corn and soybeans, feeding millions across the country. It's one of America's top agricultural producers. But inside those same borders, over 300,000 people are food insecure in 2025, unsure if they'll eat today or tomorrow or at all. How do we grow enough food to export around the world, but can't put it on the plates of our own people? Walk through downtown Des Moines or Iowa City, and you'll see modern luxury apartments climbing into the sky, rooftop gyms, concierge lobbies, smart elevators. Just a few miles away, families are living in Walmart parking lots, washing up in public restrooms, heating canned food on camp stoves next to their vehicles. The state recently approved hundreds of millions in infrastructure upgrades, new highways, beautified corridors, upgraded stadiums. Meanwhile, a single unpaid hospital bill, a broken leg, a routine surgery, a child's infection, is enough to trigger eviction for some Iowans with no savings, no backup, and no safety net. Same streets, same sunshine, two Iowas. One grows, the other fades. One celebrates surplus, the other survives on handouts. This divide isn't about geography, it's about policy, priority, and silence. And maybe the most disturbing part, these two worlds exist side by side. We pass each other in grocery aisles, at stoplights, on sidewalks. Which Iowa do you live in? Which one do you see, and which one are we pretending not to? Let us know in the comments. Let's talk about it, because change never begins with silence. Number 7, a way forward. So how do we fix this? First, Iowa could repurpose public land and vacant buildings into affordable housing. Empty warehouses and used lots could become safe, stable homes for people who need them most. Second, rental support needs to be tied to income. If someone loses their job or works minimum wage, their rent shouldn't eat up their entire paycheck. A flexible subsidy system could stop homelessness before it starts. Third, the minimum wage must reflect the real cost of living. $7.25 an hour, Iowa's current rate, is no longer enough to survive, let alone save. And finally, healthcare has to be more accessible. Community clinics and mobile medical units can bring basic care to rural and low-income areas, preventing minor issues from becoming major, life-altering problems. These solutions aren't impossible. In fact, they're already being discussed, but talking isn't enough. Number 8, when hope arrives in a paper bag. Sometimes, hope doesn't come in big announcements or sweeping reforms. Sometimes, it shows up in a paper bag with 2 sandwiches, a pair of socks, and a handwritten note that simply says, "You matter." On the coldest nights in Des Moines, when the wind cuts through layers like a blade, small volunteer groups drive the back streets. No spotlight, no news crew, just neighbors handing out blankets, hand warmers, and cups of hot soup to people sleeping on concrete. It's not a solution, but for someone shivering alone under an overpass, it's the difference between despair and dignity. In Iowa City, a nonprofit called Second Start runs weekly workshops teaching woodworking, welding, and plumbing to people with no formal address. No ID, no problem. Just show up, learn something, feel human again. For many, it's the first time in months, even years, that someone looked them in the eye and said, "You can do this." And then there's Marcus. He used to sleep behind a gas station with his son after losing their home to medical debt. He hated himself for it, not because he was homeless, but because he couldn't explain it to his boy. "I used to say we were camping," he told me. But he knew. Today, Marcus is a certified carpenter. He builds transitional shelters for other families going through what he once did. The first frame he raised was for a single mom with 2 kids. "That was the moment I came back to life," he said, "because I wasn't just building her house, I was rebuilding myself. That's the quiet power of community. Not a miracle, not a headline, just people, broken, healing, helping. Because, in a world where policy sometimes forgets, people remember. So if you're wondering whether small acts matter, they do. They always have. And maybe they're what's holding Iowa together, one coat, one meal, one rebuilt life at a time. And so, within the heart of America's farmland, amid golden fields that stretch to the horizon and skies that seem endless, another story quietly unfolds. It's not written in textbooks or featured in glossy travel brochures. It's etched instead in the lines of a mother's tired face, in the silence of a child who's learned too soon that dreams don't always come true. Here in Iowa, abundance and absence live side by side, a state that feeds millions, yet leaves many of its own to wonder where their next meal will come from. A place of extraordinary wealth, where too many sleep without walls to protect them from the wind. And yet, beneath this contradiction, something fragile and beautiful still stirs. The kindness of strangers, a warm blanket shared on a frozen night, the simple courage of those who have fallen and rise again, not just for themselves, but for others. This, too, is Iowa. And as we leave this story behind, the question remains, not for the state, but for each of us. In a world where it's easy to look away, will we choose to see? If this journey has moved you, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to NVL Travel Documentary and continue exploring the unseen, the overlooked, and the quietly extraordinary corners of our world. Because sometimes, the stories that matter most are the ones unfolding in silence.